and welcome to this session. This is Open Source Security, a maintainer-first approach to vulnerability disclosure. My name is Nancy Gariché. I'm a developer advocate at GitHub Security Lab, where I work with truly brilliant security researchers and curators who are passionate about inspiring and enabling you, the community, to secure the open source ecosystem we all depend on. As you may know, security vulnerabilities or security bugs are not quite the same as any other bug. They may not always be more important, but security bugs tend to be more sensitive. Unpatched security bugs that are not kept private until they're fixed could be exploited by bad actors and lead to horrible consequences. In our research and experience at the lab, we found that the process of finding security vulnerability and adequately notifying open source maintainers is not always clear to everyone. That's why I would like to use our time together today to share with you some of the processes and best practices to follow when a security issue is discovered in an open source project. I'd like to provide some clarity and advice around this process for both project maintainers and vulnerability reporters. Open source is now more popular than ever and underlies and enables much of the world's most popular technology platforms. According to All Things Open Source, open source comprises the majority of code in a typical application. 90% of IT leaders are using enterprise open source, and 95% of enterprises say open source is strategically important. So if open source is so ubiquitous, so strategically important, and we rely on it so much, I hope you'll agree with me that we need to spend some time, energy, and thoughts on keeping the ecosystem safe and trustworthy for all. We must work together to ensure that the vulnerabilities that affect it are resolved as quickly as possible for everyone. At the lab, again, our internal research led by my colleague Awa Otari of the vulnerability disclosure process indicates that we could improve open source security if we enable maintainers and security bug reporters. By the way, I'll sometimes call them security researchers or contributors. Essentially, I'm talking about whoever is providing or reporting a security vulnerabilities to maintainers. So if we get these two personas, the maintainers and the reporters, to interact and collaborate more efficiently, we can achieve the shared goal of getting good security fixes. Commonly, maintainers and contributors are used to dealing with issues. It's nothing new. In many aspects, vulnerability reporters are contributors. Like any other contributors, they highlight issues to improve the project. However, the problem is that the usual process for non-security issues is often not adequate for security-related issues. Correcting security flaws, especially when they're not publicly known yet, as I said earlier, is a sensitive process. Disclosing information about how a project is vulnerable and how to exploit it is not something that you put in a public issue in a repository that anybody can see if there's no patch available, because you're exposing the users of that projects to these attacks, basically. So publicizing this information could inform malicious attackers on how to exploit a vulnerability. If a contributor cannot share a vulnerability with maintainers publicly, how are they supposed to do it? Unfortunately, the answer is not always the same. That's why we recommend maintainers to have a security policy. Open source maintainers and contributors, and you probably know about contributing.md help file. A contributing.md file, in case you're not familiar, it tells contributors how to participate in a project. It may include information on how to file a bug report, or how to suggest a new feature, or even how to set up your environment to run tests. So a contributing.md file is an opportunity for maintainers to communicate their expectations for contributions, such as the type of contribution they're looking for, or how contributors should or should not get in touch with them. Security.md is the lesser-known version of lesser-known health file that has a very similar goal, but for a security context. If you're a maintainer, you want to make sure that you have a clear security policy that is easy to find, right? Potential contributors who want to report a vulnerability that affect your project should easily be able to figure out who to contact and how to contact you or a team member. They should know exactly how to report it. And those contributors want to help by reporting a vulnerability. It can be really frustrating not knowing how to reach out to the people in charge. Take the guesswork as a maintainer out of the whole process, or you may have to deal with spam emails, or even worse, when it gets too hard, people by sheer frustration may decide to just publicly disclose the vulnerability, which means that you'll have a 0-day vulnerability out there, and we don't want that. So how do we make that happen? How do we get a security policy? If your repository is on GitHub, on the security tab, you can easily add a security markdown file to define a security policy. Right? And all a policy is, a security policy is a statement that tells vulnerability reporters on how and where to report a security bug and to the project security contact. It sets expectation for communication and responses. It really doesn't have to be long or complicated. Oh, here's an example from the systemd project. They provide contact information and a short description of their process. That's it. Reporters will be super happy, super pleased if you have a policy like that, because it makes their life so much easier. A vulnerability reporter, for vulnerability reporters, I suggest always starting by reviewing the security policy and to follow it. Review it to learn how to properly engage with the security contact. And following the rules of engagement described in that policy improve your chances to have your issue looked at and addressed as quickly as possible and in private. The security policy is also where you'll find the security contact information. Bigger projects may have a dedicated vulnerability management team, excuse me, called VMT. You may have heard that acronym. Typically, that's a small number of individuals who are responsible for promptly responding to vulnerability report. Remember, these reports are sensitive. So even within your project, you don't need to make those reports accessible to everyone, right? The need to know principle. Keep the report confidential as much as possible while they're being addressed. The team ensure that the disclosure process is being followed. And of course, for a smaller project, the security team, the vulnerability management team is probably just one security contact, and it's probably the maintainer himself or herself who basically has many hats, many other hats for the project. So what happens next? So enter CVD. CVD is short for Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure. CVD is a process through which a reporter privately initiates a dialogue with a project maintainer through their security contact. I've mentioned that. It allows both parties to coordinate and work together in private to only later publicly disclose the full details of a vulnerability, but that only once a patch is available. To be transparent and clear, most open source projects don't operate the same way, and many projects won't have a defined or mature vulnerability management process. So I'm just giving you an idea of how it should look like and how the steps that you should expect. As a maintainer, if you don't have such a process yet, I encourage you to establish it and to document it in your security policy. You don't want to wait till you get your first security issue before you research and know exactly what to do. So the policy should describe the policy and process should describe the steps your project team will follow when you're not notified of a potential security issue. And when that's available, reviewing this process will help reporters understand how to best collaborate with you, and it goes beyond the initial contact. So typically, a vulnerability management process consists of the following step: the acknowledgement, assessment of the report, the vulnerability, patch creation in private, CVE number requests, I'll tell you more about that, and public disclosure. So for acknowledgement, in a perfect world, the VMT, Vulnerability Management Team, should acknowledge receipt of the vulnerability report within a few days, ideally. So the team start by saying thank you to the reporter for their contribution and let them know how long it will take before you get back to them. If it takes, for example, 12 days to get back to a reporter, and you know this, but they're not aware of that, of your processing time, and they're eager, they may decide that they may conclude that you're not taking their matter seriously. So setting an expectation and letting them know how long it may take before they hear back from you really goes a long way. Assessment. Oh, so what is it that you need to assess as a maintainer? Well, you should assess if the reported vulnerability is a security threat. To help you make that assessment, I suggest using a well-known concept by security professionals, at least, called the CIA Triad. The C stands for confidentiality. Does this bug allow an unauthorized person to access information they should not have access to? The I stands for integrity. Does this bug allow an unauthorized person to modify data that they should not be able to modify? The A stands for availability. Does this bug allow the application to stop working? Could critical features become out of service? If the bug doesn't allow a breach in confidentiality, integrity, or availability, the project team may stop this disclosure process altogether and ask you to simply submit your bug as a public non-security issue instead. However, if it is a security threat, the disclosure process continues. And for an accurate assessment, and quick assessment, a good vulnerability report makes all the difference. The report provided by reporters should describe the vulnerability clearly and concisely. And remember that your report will not be handled by a security professional, most likely. Make your report easy to understand, like I said, to verify and to fix by avoiding security jargon and clearly explaining the vulnerability and its impact. Did you know that, unfortunately, vulnerability reporters are often viewed as bearer of bad news? During our research, maintainers shared that receiving a vulnerability report, they experience a range of emotions, including anxiety and stress. So think about it. It's just like getting a diagnosis from your doctor, okay? So if there's a diagnosis, there is technically something wrong with you. And that on its own can be very nerve-wracking. When doctors take the time to explain their diagnosis clearly in a way that you can understand, it makes the news maybe easier to digest. But you also want to know, how bad is this thing, right? You'll want to know if you'll need to take a leave of absence or if you can keep going to work or school. Will this affect your livelihood? What's the impact? The impact is really a key element to help you make decisions about what to do in the future. What can make a doctor visit almost pleasant is when, after explaining the diagnosis, they can reassure you and they have a great treatment plan that makes sure that you'll get back to your healthy self in no time. Okay, my point with this analogy is that reporters should be good open source doctors. You make your report actionable, easy to understand and to verify and fix, and that helps maintainer quickly identify the vulnerability and, when possible, provide a clear, actionable solution. Okay, so what's writing an effective report? Well, writing an effective report helps both the maintainers and reporters get to agree on how bad that security bug is. And it helps them decide how high a particular fix should be on the project's long list of competing priorities. To go back to the analogy for a minute, when you have a small cold, you don't have to cancel everything important in your life, right? But if the diagnosis is really bad, maybe you do drop everything and your one and only job at the moment is to get better. Same thing for the vulnerability. The worse it is, the action plan differs, right? So the potential impact helps us decide how to move forward. Being clear on the potential impact of the vulnerability helps maintainers understand its criticality and how to move forward. help them by precisely pointing out the code in the component that is responsible for the vulnerability, and again, suggest a fix if you can. And maintainers are leading your project, right? They're in charge. They may decide to remediate the security issue differently than what you suggested. Respect that. That shouldn't stop you from offering your help as a contributor. As someone with security knowledge, you have a unique background, and I'm convinced that most projects will really welcome your constructive input. So similar to a feature pull request, maintainers are very appreciative usually when the reporter includes recommendation on how the issue could be mitigated or resolved. Again, consider that it's not because maintainers built an awesome component that many people use that they are at the same level of proficiency and security as you are as a security researcher. Take the time to put yourself in their shoes, show some empathy and understanding. All that can go a long way. Okay, so let's go over it again. The elements to include in your report with a few additions are a detailed description of the vulnerability, the impact of the vulnerability to understand its criticality, a list of affected version, the code, precise code that introduces the vulnerability, a working, reproducible proof of concept that help maintainers verify the report and its impact. And for extra brownie points, let the maintainers know that you're willing to help throughout the patch creation process, for example. I want to let you know that the GitHub Security Lab actually made their own report template open source, so you can use it as an inspiration. And maintainers can also use that report, I find, to inspire their security policy and let reporters know what they would like to see in their vulnerability report. Provide them with a template, with a structure that they can follow so that you know that what you'll be receiving will be useful. Finally, disclosure policy. It's common knowledge that in any relationship, clear and effective communication is the cure for conflict. If not a cure, it helps a lot. And the relationship between maintainers and vulnerability reporters is no different. Right? Know that as a reporter, you can be clear about your expectation and disclosure timeline by providing your own disclosure policy with your report. So your policy can be very helpful, especially if the project team doesn't have a clear process, a clear or mature process, and if they don't have a security policy that can really help out structure what's going ahead. Okay, back to our list. Next is patch creation. Again, once the vulnerability is confirmed, the project maintainers will begin developing a patch out of the public eye, so in private. And that's the occasion that perhaps reporters can offer their help for patch development and review, and even during testing process. Security background is super helpful, and it provides additional insight that will result in a stronger remediation. If a reporter didn't explicitly offer to help, maintainers don't hesitate to reach out and ask for help for developing and testing the patch. Oh, I've explained the sensitivity of disclosure process. It's now that it's important that the patch be developed in private, in private, and a public issue, a pull request is not adequate to do that. So it's not widely known, but if your project lives on GitHub security advisories may be something you would like to look up, because it makes it easy for repository maintainers to privately discuss and fix the security vulnerability in a project. So within the GitHub security advisory, maintainers can create a draft security advisory and use it to privately discuss the impact of the vulnerability of the project and privately collaborate to fix the vulnerability in a temporary private fork. So this needs at the moment to be initiated by the maintainers. So maintainers, you create that advisory and invite within it the contributors that can help you and will keep the vulnerability and its details private. Next step is the CVE number request. The project may request a CVE entry if the vulnerability is eligible for one. Okay, so CVEs, if you don't know, are unique or a unique identification number for vulnerabilities, and they're really, really valued by most security researchers, because it gives them credit for their findings. Security researchers really collect them like Pokemons. They love CVE. That can be another talk, but let's just say that that's a good way and a common way to give credit to the security researchers for their work. And because GitHub is a CVE numbering authority, a CNA, we can issue a CVE for public projects all hosted on the platform. So within the GitHub Security Advisory created by the maintainers, you can also request a CVE, a Common Vulnerability Exposure Number, for the vulnerabilities. And finally, the last step, disclosure, public disclosure. Once a patch is published, maintainers have to notify their users and direct them on how to update their components. And having a patch for vulnerability may seem like the end of the process, but it doesn't really end there, right? How useful is a patch if nobody knows it exists? So the system will remain vulnerable. So it's important to publish the final security advisory to alert the community once the patch is released. Even use blog posts, use your social media, use whatever communication system you have to communicate with users that there is something to update. And again, since GitHub is a CNA, when the advisory is published, it becomes available to downstream consumers through the CVE number. Despite all the best efforts and intention, things sometimes just don't go as planned or as smoothly as you would like. So here's a few hurdles, especially for the reporters, that can happen, and let's see how we can fix them. First, you can't establish contact with the project team at all. You don't have any information. What we found at the lab to be the most successful way to contact a project is to open a public issue, but to not only disclose that you have a security report or vulnerability to disclose, but do not provide any details. And through that public issue, you can communicate and see how to move forward. You can also look on the web page of the project to see if they have a security.txt file or an email address you can contact. We've also seen people using social media and saying, hey, if somebody works on this project, could you please contact me? I have important information to share. So you can reach out to communities in that way. A warning, though, is that if you use an alternative contact method, avoid disclosing information, sensitive information, until you're confident that the right person will receive your report, right? There could also be a disagreement about the disclosure deadline, right? You suggested the deadline that it should be, the fix should be fixed, the patch should be developed in 90 days, but the project is running late. Well, if you see that they're making steady project, the project is making steady progress, and they have a good justification for the delays, it's a good idea to remain flexible and to consider providing more time. If you really are in a hurry and want, as a reporter, and the deadline approaches, at least make sure to let them know that the deadline is approaching and that when you plan to disclose the vulnerability. And finally, another issue that you can encounter is a project team that is completely unresponsive. And that happens for multiple reasons. But again, remain patient and don't assume that they're brushing you off or that they don't care about security. Open source projects, as you know, I'm sure, are understaffed, underfunded. There's competing priorities that may prevent teams from communicating promptly. And even if the disclosure deadline approaches and you decide to move forward with a full disclosure with a publication, remain positive and professional. There's no winners when there's a hostile environment. And as a last resort, like I said, you could go with the full disclosure, which means that you're making the vulnerability public, and that could lead definitely to a 0-day vulnerability if there is no patch. Or you can report to a third party. Because if, for example, the vulnerability is very easy to exploit, and it has a big consequences, then full disclosure is dangerous. So consider reaching out to a third party for help, such as an industry regulator or a data protection authority. If you're unsure about how to proceed, we welcome you to contact the GitHub Security Lab for advice. We would be happy to help. Okay, on the maintainer side, usually it's because you ran out of time, right? Your deadline, you can't patch in time, or the vulnerability has been disclosed in a public issue and you don't have a patch for it. Well, at this point, it's not the time to keep secrets and to work in private. It's time to communicate. Use your social media platforms, use your blog, use the media that you have to communicate as much as possible with your consumer. And even if you don't have a patch, give ideas on how to mitigate the issues and give as many details as you can. That's it. We're coming to an end. I'd just like, before I leave you, to recap a bit of the advice that I've provided, both for maintainers and for reporters. So let's start with maintainers. Make sure, look at your security policy, make sure you have one, provide contact information. Think about your vulnerability management process. What will we do if we get a security report? Don't wait at the last minute to think about that and document that. Look into the private patch environment that you'll use when it's time to collaborate on a patch with a reporter. Look at the GitHub security advisories that could help you out with that. Understand that having a patch, it's not the end of the journey. You have to notify your consumers. You have to make sure that the information is out there and that they know that they need to update. And finally, give credit to reporters. They've helped you finding this vulnerability. Use the CVE request process to get a CVE, to find a way to credit them for their report. Finally, reporter, remember that you have a disclosure policy yourself that you can include in your report to express your expectations as well. Show some empathy. Understand that it's not because you're not getting the response as quickly as you want that people don't take care about security. Write an effective report, and remember that you're a contributor. Right? If you have the cycles for it, consider offering the time to help during the patch development or even for testing. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention. It's been great to be with you. And thank you for the organizers for the invitation to speak. And please reach out at the GitHub Security Lab Twitter handle and on our website. And we'll be happy to help if you have any more questions. Thank you.
Bienvenidos de vuelta, nerds. Estoy acá con Nancy, así que switchamos al inglés. Hello, Nancy. How are you?
Excellent. Yourself?
Very good. Welcome to Nerdiala. So let's dive in with one of the questions from the audience. So Roy is asking you, first of all, he says, it's an excellent talk. Do you have models of the MD files that you mentioned? And where can I read more about requesting a CVE?
Okay. First of all, for the MD files, yes, we do have template. The GitHub Security Lab does provide those templates because we want to encourage people to have them. And I don't have a link. I think it's a longer link, but what I would advise, follow us on Twitter, ask a DM, and we'll send that to you. Absolutely. Maybe a Google search will bring it up as well. But definitely we have templates because we want to encourage people to have them and to implement them in their repository, because we don't see as many security.md in repositories.
Right. Okay. Cool. Awesome. And
the second part of your question, could you repeat that? I missed
sure.
The
second part was, and where can I read more about requesting a SVE? I'm sorry about that. SVE. Where he can find...
Like a CVE?
Yeah.
Okay. For the GitHub security advisories, that's where I would look into.
Yeah.
We have a process internally when you host a project on GitHub where you can ask for a CVE, and it's really easy once you use the GitHub security advisory. Of course, there are requirements for them to be eligible for them, but as soon as you use the GitHub security advisories, there's an option that you can use to ask for a CVE, and that's the curators on my team doing the manual work or going through them. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, cheers to them as well. And
yes.
one last question. Gabriel is asking, how do I start helping to solve security problems in the code?
In the code. Well, first of all, because it's open source, you do have access to the code. That's why it's a great way to learn. And okay, so that's my personal advice. I think people start differently, but I think once you start your education in security and you have a vulnerability in mind, try to find that specific vulnerability in that project or in multiple projects so that you can be more, because you're more familiar with that vulnerability, and then can inform the project maintainers on how to fix that vulnerability, so that you kind of become an expert of that vulnerability and are able to help the project to resolve that issue. So that's how it starts, by still following the process of maintainer first approach, contacting them, telling them what you found, why you think it's important, why do you think the impact is so great, and giving them contact information so that they know how to reach out to you to help out and test the vulnerability. Test the patch for the vulnerability.
Nancy, that sounds like great advice. And that will be all for today in terms of Q&A. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, for sure. And welcome to Nerdiala. Hopefully we can see you again.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Cheers. Bien, bueno, volvemos. Hago un switch de idioma de vuelta y acá seguimos con el track de security. Tengo para contarles un par de cosas más. Algo que no mencionamos hasta ahora y que les recomiendo mucho que vayan a chequear es el canal de Backstage de Nerdearla. Pueden ver todo lo que está pasando en el vivo, en el Conex, entrevistas a la gente, todo el detrás de escena de Nerdearla por ahí, no se lo pueden perder. También pueden acercarse al stand de Falabella, que están con una experiencia de realidad aumentada, usando su hashtag Falabella Transforma, pueden participar y ganar un montón de premios. Y los voy a dejar ahora con otra charla en inglés de Bruce Schneider que se llama The Coming AI Hackers. Y los dejo con él, vamos a escucharlo.
Vamos a nerdear.